Yesterday, on the 1 year anniversary of the police murder of George Floyd, the Republican politician and former Georgia State Representative Vernon Jones tweeted this: "I wish people recognize the death of Jesus Christ as much as they do George Floyd. That's all I have to say." You know, it's an electrifying experience when you find a tweet that expresses word for word the direct opposite of what you believe. It actually happens quite often on Twitter, which is why it makes it such an enraging place to navigate. And this is one of those tweets. It's been a while since I've made a video, by the way. I actually watched that Lil Nas X Montero music video and got possessed by demons for a bit. And no matter how many times I said I should have bought a Honda, but I bought a Kia, speaking in tongues just wasn't helping. And then I ended up getting the COVID vaccine, and surprisingly, it took the demons right out of me. So, anti-vax evangelicals, please get the vaccine. It's literally the opposite of what you believe it is. Nah, but for real, I've actually been working on a book, but it's not going to come out until next year, so let's talk about it next year. Now, anyway, I seriously do believe the direct opposite of this tweet. I wish that people would recognize the death of George Floyd as much as they do the death of Jesus Christ, because then they would have a more authentic understanding of the death of Jesus within its historical context. When it comes to the crucifixion, there's a lot we can talk about as for what it says about God and our relationship with God. And in this video, I'm not dismissing those parts of the meaning of the crucifixion as insignificant, but I just want to talk about the significant material implications to the crucifixion that we often forget about as we're constantly talking about the spiritual implications. Madonna isn't the only one who lives in a material world. We all do. Grab something in front of you if you don't believe me. So when I was a kid growing up in church, I used to always hear pastors go on and on about the torture that Jesus suffered. Even sometimes going into a kind of like medical perspective about like the level of damage that his injuries would have caused based on the few wounds mentioned in the scriptures.
The person who is crucified has a very difficult time gathering air in their lungs and breathing, so they pass in and out of consciousness.
Especially during Good Friday and Easter, they would go into so many details about all the pain and blood and nails going through his hands and his feet and him hanging on the cross, all that.
Those who were being crucified suffered the most excruciating agony. And actually, the word excruciating literally means from the cross, so that a word was invented to explain the pain of crucifixion.
Actually, it wasn't until I was an adult that I discovered that a common complaint about the movie The Passion of the Christ was that Mel Gibson went a bit overboard with how bloody and violent he depicted the crucifixion, like almost fetishizing the torture that Jesus went through. But as a kid, I had no sense that this was an issue at all, because it just seemed like an obvious film adaptation of what was described to me almost every week at church. Like 40 minutes into the bloodbath, and I'm like, yeah, this is exactly how they said it went down. This makes sense. Also, Jesus invented the table. It makes a little less sense, but it's still a vibe, I guess. Yeah. And so all the brutal descriptions of torture that Jesus went through were accurate when it comes to what crucifixion was like. But it was all to say, look how Jesus suffered for you when he died for you. The strange thing about these presentations was that I wasn't aware until many years later that thousands upon thousands of people were crucified by the Roman government. This wasn't as unique of a death as it was described to me as a kid. Everything that Jesus went through on the cross was typical of everybody else who was crucified. Crucifixion was a specific type of execution that the Romans perfected, and it was reserved solely for the crime of sedition. for the rebels who resisted against Rome. And crucifixions were always done in a public setting, like on a hill at the entrance of a city, so that everyone can see that this is what happens to you when you resist Rome. And almost everybody who claimed to be the Messiah were crucified, because claiming that you're ushering in the kingdom of God is implying the ushering out of the kingdom of Caesar. So dying on a cross was the most brutal and humiliating way of dying in the first century. And Jesus, as God incarnate, dies this way too. One of the most significant components to understanding the crucifixion is realizing that this moment is a profound act of solidarity. Jesus experienced the suffering that was experienced by the most persecuted people in society. People expected Jesus to reveal the almighty power of God, but on the cross, Jesus reveals powerlessness as a victim of earthly powers. So we could talk about all the ways that Jesus suffered and died for you, but there are many times where my soul needs to hear the message that Jesus suffered and died with you, with those who suffer the most in this world. The liberation theologian Ignacio Ellacuría talked about how the crucifixion should compel us to look for the crucified peoples in history, all those who have suffered the most because of injustice. All those that we put on crosses because of the perpetuation of injustice, and how we can take them off the cross by putting an end to the injustice that causes their suffering. When we can look at the crucified peoples in the world today, then we can gain a much deeper understanding of Jesus as a crucified person. James Cone, Black liberation theologian, wrote a book arguing this called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, pointing out how similar lynchings are to crucifixion, where a crowd would torture and hang a black person in a tree as a way of warning other black people against stepping out of their place. And James Cone rightly calls the crucifixion a first century lynching. And it is through looking at the first century cross through the 20th century lynching tree that we can get a deeper understanding of the context of the cross and therefore of the cross itself. We are completely removed from the context of the oppression of the Roman Empire, but we can get a glimpse of that context by looking at how more familiar empires of today oppress and kill people. So, George Floyd's death is a death that we pay attention to, not because he was like this legendary great hero or something like that. And the conservative pundits who say that that's how people frame him, just know that they're lying, because nobody actually frames it that way except for conservative pundits. But, conservative pundits lie. Water is wet. My crush won't text back. What else is new? But anyway, we pay attention to George Floyd's death because his death as a black man murdered by police is representative of a larger system of violence that the crucified peoples of the United States suffer through. So this is why I say that actually understanding George Floyd's death and its context can help us have a better understanding of Jesus' death and its context. Because it's not like Jesus was the only one that shouldn't have been crucified. No one should have been crucified. It's not like just these great heroes like Jesus didn't deserve it. No one deserved it. No matter who they are. And lastly, a question you may have is, well, what about resurrection? There's a really good Christian leftist podcast called The Magnificast, and they recently did an episode on crucifixion and resurrection from a similar perspective as what we've been talking about. And when they were talking about resurrection, I thought that one of the co-hosts, Dean Detloff, had a brilliant point about how resurrection in the Christian tradition is understood as the defeat of death. And you may not know that, but like when we look at Paul and the other early Christians, resurrection was not understood as like this really cool guy rose from the dead in a really cool way one time. No, it was understood as the symbolic first fruits of the ultimate defeat of death. Not just Jesus' death, but death itself. And so Dean mentions this quote from Karl Marx in The German Ideology, where Marx says, "We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things." And that got Dean thinking how, from a materialist perspective, we can understand the resurrection in a similar way. And we can even say, we call resurrection the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. And then Dean made the point that if resurrection is about the abolition of death, then it should also be about the abolition of things that cause death. The abolition of the police, the abolition of systemic racism, the abolition of labor exploitation. So, resurrection should empower us to defeat the actual material powers of death in the world today, crucifying people every day. That's what we're called to do. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe for more videos like this. We're back. We're going to be posting way more videos, no more super long breaks. And make sure you follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/whoisdamon, because we're streaming again as well. And if you'd like to support me, I'd greatly appreciate it at patreon.com/Damon Garcia. And thank you, everyone over there who's been supporting me. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.